Hi everyone and welcome. Let's talk about animal fats being whether they are actually saturated fats. When I grew up, I was taught that all fats that are solid at room temperature were saturated and should therefore be avoided. And I was also told that animal fats were saturated fats, so animal fats equal saturated fats. And it was as simple as that. And unfortunately, we are still talking about animal fats being saturated fats, and we're still talking about all types of fats in this simplistic way. And that is not true because all fats are a mix of saturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and monounsaturated fats. So they have different types of fatty acid profiles. In the group of saturated fats, we have different types of saturated fats, which is depending on the length of the carbon chain, that is fat. And I'm not going to talk about that specifically today. I'm more going to talk about the big groups. So we're going to have a little look at the fat composition of beef, actually. I decided to just look at beef today. So how much saturated fat it actually contains, because that is obviously of interest because we are equaling it to saturated fat. And I'm also going to have a little look at the omega-6 to 3 ratio, because that is also interesting. And if you don't know already, omega-3s and omega-6s are polyunsaturated fats. So we might be saying that, oh, we should eat saturated fat. But it's not that simple, because most fats are not just saturated fat. Unfortunately, maybe, I don't know, probably not. We're probably meant to have a mix of different fats. That's what we have evolved eating, and that's what we probably do best on. So I'm also going to compare grass-fed beef with grain-fed beef, because I think that is something that is really important when it comes to fat quality. So when we're just talking about muscle meat, if you're having a lean cut of meat, it probably for most people doesn't matter too much if you are having a grain-fed lean steak or if you're having a grass-fed lean steak. But as soon as you start adding a lot of the fat, because that's where we see the biggest difference in fat quality, what they contain, and probably also some toxins, maybe mold toxins and other things that we don't really want to consume necessarily. So, as I said, I'm not gonna go into the types of saturated fats. You have different types of them, or polyunsaturates apart from the omega-6s and omega-3s. So they will be two groups of fats, omega-3s and omega-6s, no matter what type of omega-3 or 6 they are. If you want to have a more thorough look at that, I will link to a review article in the comments, or sorry, in the description to this video. And while we're talking about the description, etc., if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do so. Just hit the subscribe button down there, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to be notified whenever I'm posting a new video or when I'm going live, which I'm doing every weekend, you can press that bell icon as well, and it should let you know. So now keep in mind that in putting all of this data together for this video, I was taking figures from several different studies, and I was looking at different types of cattle. And there's a huge difference between fat composition between different types of cattle. Okay, so when we go to the supermarket, it will never tell you what type of cattle it was. So this is kind of a very loose average, if you like, but I still compared the grain-fed with the grass-fed for the same type of cattle. I've used both values, so there might be a variation in reality, but this is kind of a loose average. So just keep that in mind. I don't want to deceive you and say that these numbers are definite, because they're not. It totally depends on what type of cattle you are consuming. Okay, So if you are someone who is planning on raising your own cattle, or you want to find a type of breed that will suit your needs best and have the best fatty acid profile, maybe have more fat or less fat than the average cattle, then you need to do your research yourself. Just, go and Google it. It's not that hard to find information nowadays. Okay, so let's start with having a look at the distribution of saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat in beef. So I'm going to bring this up here. So this is basically what it looks like. So on the left you have grass-fed beef, and on the right you have grain-fed beef. The big green pie, if you like, is saturated fat. So you can see grass-fed beef is slightly higher in saturated fat. It's not a huge difference. We can almost say that they're kind of similar. So this tends to be the go-to for cows, how much saturated fat they will in general contain, whether they are grass-fed or grain-fed. And the same actually goes for monounsaturated fats. There's a slight difference, but I think we can say that for both saturated and monounsaturated fats, there is around 40 to 45%, and it seems to be kind of similar between both grass-fed and grain-fed. And then we have the blue one, which is polyunsaturated fat. And you can see there is almost 50% more polyunsaturates in grass-fed beef. So hang on now, before you panic. I'm going to tell you this, that the majority of the extra polyunsaturated fats that are in the grass-fed beef comes from omega-3s. And this is really, really important. I'm going to bring it up on my next slide. But just keep that in mind. So first of all, you're looking at this. Sure, for grass-fed beef, the majority, if we are comparing the 3 different types of fat, is saturated fat. But it's less than 50% of the total fatty acid profile. So if we were to group together monounsaturated and polyunsaturated, as we often do when we talk about unsaturated fats, because we are supposed to be heart healthy, then grass-fed beef is more unsaturated than saturated. So why are we talking about animal fats as being saturated fats? It has a large amount of saturated fats, but it's not majorly made out of saturated fat. And the same goes for grain-fed beef. There are less polyunsaturated fats, and that is in a way good, because polyunsaturated fats are the ones that most easily oxidize. So those are the ones that are going to be causing problems when they are getting incorporated into your cell membranes, etc. However, as I said, we're going to have a look at the next slide. Here we go. The ratio between omega-6 to omega-3 is very important. Now, before I'm talking about this picture, I want you to be aware of, so the omega-6 to 3 ratio that we want to aim for, or that we are told that we want to aim for, that is supposed to be ideal, is something less than 4 to 1, okay? Anything higher than that is considered very inflammatory and undesirable. So here is the biggest difference between the grass-fed and the grain-fed beef. So the grass-fed has, on average, in the cattle that I measured, a ratio of 2 to 1, whereas the grain-fed ones 8.3 to 1. So I would say 8.3 to 1 is pretty bad, but if you compare to a lot of other foods, that is actually not too bad. But it's still too high. We don't really want to be there. So when you're choosing what sort of fat you're eating, it's extremely important that you're getting it from a grass-fed cow, and a grass-finished cow preferably, because that is making a huge difference as well. I just want to say that. And I just want to point out as well that when I was looking at the grass-fed varieties, some of them had a really, really great omega-6 to 3 ratio of roughly 1.5 to 1. And the worst one was probably around 3.5 to 1. So that is still within the limits for what we are recommended to actually seek out. So that's the good news, but you know, there might be a difference. Just want you to be aware of that. That is not always 2 to 1. If you're Googling it on the internet, you might find some, at least I found this, saying that a grass-fed cow is usually 3 to 1. Now that's not what I found, but there are cows that are 3 to 1. Absolutely. So whether it's 3 to 1 or 2 to 1, they're both pretty good. Obviously, in the past, I think that we probably used to be closer to 1 to 1 when we were only consuming wild animals. Okay, so if you want to get there, you probably have to hunt some wild animals and hope that they're quite fatty as well. So let's have a look at these figures down here as well. So the red one is omega-6s and the green one is omega-3s. And the percentage there, which says for the grass-fed, says 8.5 and 4.2, that it's the percentage of total fat in this cow. So 8.5% of the fat in the grass-fed beef is omega-6 and 4.2 is omega-3, etc. And you can see there is slightly less omega-6s actually in the grain-fed beef. This surprised me a little bit because they are obviously fed grain-fed beef, and sometimes they do add some fat to their diets, which would most likely be oils, etc. So I thought that might be a little bit higher, but as you can see, they're missing out on the omega-3s because they're not eating grass, etc. So there you go. And anyway, as you can see, there is a huge difference, and if you are on a budget, let's say, I actually did this myself this week. I got I got 2 types of meats from the butchers. I got beef heart, which has some fat on it, but let's say you're going to the butchers or you're going to a supermarket, you get really lean steak, which is grain-fed because that is what you can afford. Then you go to your butcher and you say, do you have any grass-fed beef suet, for example, or just grass-fed beef offcuts, or whatever it might be, but you want to have a good fat quality. And I got roughly, I asked for 4 to 5 kilos. They gave me 3, I think, or 3.5, something like that. Maybe less even, maybe 2.5, I can't remember, of grass-fed beef suet. So now I can eat my steak, which could be really cheap, and I can just add a lot of beef suet that is actually super high quality fat. And that way you kind of engineering your own steak or your own meal with good fat and cheap meat, because usually meat is what is most expensive. Most people do not want a lot of fat, so butchers have to cut it off. Most of the time they can't sell very fatty meat cuts because most people don't want them, and that is good for us people who actually like to eat fat. So with that said, what I want to say now is that animal fat does not equal saturated fat. Okay, it's a mix, roughly 50-50, but of saturated, well, it's 50-50 saturated monounsaturated fats with the addition of some polyunsaturates. So we saw, I'll just get it up again. So we saw here that it was 12 point, let me get that one, so 12.5% of polyunsaturated, and we have 8.5 omega-6, 4.2 omega-3, and that is pretty much all of it. And remember, this is an average, so I have been rounding the figures, so there might be something else in there, like a little bit of omega-9s or whatever, but roughly that is what it looks like. So when we're looking at whatever polyunsaturated fats are in there, is mainly omega-6s and omega-3s, and we need both, but we're just getting too much of the omega-6s. So we want to stick with whatever fat we can get our hands on that contains as much omega-3s as possible. And sure, you can eat your fish for omega-3s, that's all good, but even the fattest fish is usually leaner than the steak that you're having. So from now on, whenever we're talking about get your animal fats in, I would prefer that we are starting to say animal fats, good quality animal fats, rather than saturated fats, because it's not true. If you want saturated fats, then go and eat coconut oil or something else that is much, much higher in saturated fat. I think coconut oil is almost 90% saturated fat. But the vegans are not going to run away from coconut oil, are they? No, coconut oil is great. Coconut oil is really good for us because there are a lot of MCTs in there, medium chain triglycerides, and etc. Lauric acid. I'm not saying that coconut oil isn't good, but we need to talk about the fats in a different type of way, I think. So just think about it. Next time you say polyunsaturated or unsaturated fats, is that true? Or do they contain more saturated? Maybe there's a mix, and we need to start looking at foods in a different type of way, I think. So that was everything I had to say today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again very soon. Bye!